The morning sun cast long shadows across Meridian Airport's weathered tarmac, but inside the National Hurricane Center's Field Operations building, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in the back corner of the briefing room, her weathered leather jacket, a stark contrast to the crisp uniforms and pressed suits surrounding her. Her chair bore no official designation, no agency logo, just a simple folded nameplate that read, Independent Contractor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Around her, meteorologists from NOAA, pilots from the Air Force Reserve's Hurricane Hunters, and officials from the Federal Emergency Management Agency filled seats marked with gleaming agency seals and official credentials. Their equipment was state-of-the-art, their aircraft million-dollar marvels of modern engineering, their data systems connected to satellites that could peer into the heart of any storm from space. Sarah's aircraft sat alone on the far edge of the airfield, separated from the sleek government planes like an unwanted stepchild. The 1987 Beechcraft King Air 350 had seen better decades. Its white paint was yellowed with age, the registration numbers faded but still legible, N847SC. No government markings adorned its fuselage. No official insignia proclaimed its purpose. It was just an old twin-engine turboprop that most people assumed belonged in a museum rather than a hurricane. Dr. Marcus Kellerman, the Hurricane Center's deputy director, activated the wall-mounted display screens with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd briefed countless storm operations. Satellite imagery filled the monitors, showing Hurricane Diana spinning in the Gulf of Mexico like a cosmic buzzsaw, her eye wall clearly defined, her spiral arms stretching across hundreds of miles of ocean. Ladies and gentlemen, Kellerman began, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in meteorology. We're looking at a potentially catastrophic situation. Diana has intensified overnight to a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. Current projections show landfall along the Louisiana coast in 18 hours. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah studied the satellite images with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 15 years chasing storms, but she saw details that others missed. The asymmetric structure of the eye wall, the unusual thermal signatures in the outer bands, the way the storm's circulation seemed to pulse with an irregular rhythm. Our primary concern, Kellerman continued, is the storm surge. We're predicting 15 to 20 feet of water along the immediate coastline, with inland flooding extending up to 50 miles from shore. Evacuation orders have been issued for 3 parishes, affecting nearly 500,000 residents. Air Force Colonel Janet Rodriguez, commander of the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, leaned forward in her chair. Her Hurricane Hunter crews had been flying into storms for decades, their WC-130J aircraft, equipped with the most advanced atmospheric sensing equipment ever developed. We've completed 2 penetrations of the eye wall, she reported. Wind speeds are increasing, and the pressure is continuing to drop. This storm is still strengthening. Sarah raised her hand, the gesture so unexpected that several heads turned in her direction. Kellerman paused mid-sentence, looking slightly annoyed at the interruption. Dr. Chen, do you have a question? I'm curious about the wind shear measurements in Sectors 7 and 9, Sarah said, her voice calm and professional. The data from your last pass shows some unusual variations that might indicate rapid intensification patterns. Kellerman glanced at his notes, then back at Sarah with barely concealed impatience. Our models are quite comprehensive, Dr. Chen. We don't need speculation about unusual patterns when we have real-time data from the most sophisticated hurricane reconnaissance aircraft in the world. Several people in the room exchanged glances, some amused, others dismissive. The woman with the old airplane asking about data interpretation. How presumptuous. Of course, Sarah replied, settling back into her chair. She didn't speak again for the remainder of the briefing, but her mind was racing. She'd seen those wind shear patterns before, during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The storm had exhibited similar characteristics just before undergoing explosive intensification that caught everyone off guard. As the briefing concluded and officials filed out to their respective agencies, Sarah remained in her seat, studying the satellite loops on her tablet. The storm was beautiful in its terrible symmetry, but also deeply complex in ways that the standard models might not capture. She'd learned to read hurricanes like others read books, understanding their moods, their intentions, their hidden surprises. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a young meteorologist from the University of Miami, approached Sarah's corner of the room. Unlike the others, Elena's expression showed curiosity rather than dismissal. Dr. Chen, I've read some of your papers on mesocyclone behavior in tropical systems. Your work on embedded supercells is fascinating. Sarah looked up, surprised by the genuine interest. Thank you. Most people find it too theoretical. Not theoretical at all, Elena insisted. Your research predicted several rapid intensification events that the operational models missed. I'm particularly interested in your theories about boundary layer interactions in the eye wall. They discussed atmospheric dynamics for several minutes, Elena asking pointed questions about Sarah's research methods and observational techniques. It was the first substantive scientific conversation Sarah had enjoyed in months. Can I ask you something? Elena said finally. Why do you still fly that old King Air when there are so many modern research platforms available? Sarah smiled for the first time that morning. Because that old King Air can go places and do things that the modern platforms can't. Sometimes the best tool for the job isn't the newest one. Elena nodded thoughtfully. I'd love to see your setup sometime. You're welcome to look around, Sarah offered. Most people think it's just junk, but there's more to it than meets the eye. The hangar that housed Sarah's aircraft smelled of aviation fuel and old metal, but it was meticulously organized. Every tool had its place. Every piece of equipment was properly maintained. Every surface was clean, despite the age of the building. The King Air sat in the center of the space, like a veteran warrior, its scars telling stories of countless encounters with nature's fury. Tom Morrison, Sarah's crew chief, was already conducting pre-flight checks when she arrived. The 60-year-old mechanic had been working on aircraft since before Sarah was born, his hands bearing the calluses and scars of 4 decades spent coaxing life from engines and electronics. Morning, Doc, he said without looking up from his checklist. She's ready to fly. Any word from the weather service about our flight plan? Sarah asked. Tom shrugged, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. They approved it, but I could hear the skepticism in the controller's voice. Nobody understands why you want to fly into the worst part of the storm when everyone else is staying in the eye. Sarah understood their skepticism. Her proposed flight plan called for penetrating Diana's eye wall at multiple altitudes, collecting atmospheric data in the storm's most violent regions while the hurricane hunters stayed safely in the relatively calm eye. To outside observers, it looked like a suicide mission flown by someone too stubborn to admit her equipment was obsolete. But Sarah knew something they didn't. Her King Air had been extensively modified over the years, equipped with specialized sensors and reinforced structures that made it uniquely suited for extreme weather penetration. The aircraft wasn't pretty, but it was tough, reliable, and capable of collecting data that larger, more complex platforms couldn't gather. Tom, did you install the new pressure sensors in the wing roots? Yesterday afternoon, he confirmed. All calibrated and tested. The data acquisition system is running perfectly, and I've got backup storage for everything we collect. Sarah walked around the aircraft, conducting her own inspection. The King Air's exterior showed its age, but every rivet was solid. Every control surface moved smoothly. Every piece of safety equipment was in perfect working order. She'd learned to trust this machine with her life because she understood exactly what it could and couldn't do. The weather briefing an hour later painted an increasingly dire picture. Hurricane Diana had continued to strengthen, her winds now reaching 160 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 200. The storm was a monster, one of the most powerful hurricanes ever recorded in the Gulf of Mexico. This is getting beyond our operational limits, Colonel Rodriguez announced during the final pilot briefing. We're calling off the afternoon penetration flights. The turbulence levels are exceeding what our aircraft can safely handle. Sarah looked up from her flight planning materials. What about the eye wall replacement cycle? If Diana undergoes eye wall replacement in the next 6 hours, the wind speeds could change dramatically. We need continuous monitoring to predict the timing. Dr. Chen, Kellerman interrupted, his patience clearly exhausted. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but this storm is simply too dangerous for continued research flights. We have sufficient data to maintain our forecasts. But the models are showing inconsistencies in the pressure gradient calculations, Sarah persisted. If we don't have real-time data from the eye-wall interface, we could be missing critical changes in the storm's structure. Several pilots exchanged glances. The woman with the antique airplane was questioning the judgment of people who'd been flying hurricanes since before she learned to read weather maps. "Ma'am," said Captain Mike Stevens, one of the Hurricane Hunter pilots, "with all due respect, you've never flown in conditions like this. Diana isn't just a hurricane. She's a Category 4 monster with embedded supercells that would tear most aircraft apart. This isn't a job for civilian contractors with vintage equipment." Sarah felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd heard variations of this speech countless times over the years. Too small, too old, too inexperienced, too reckless. People saw her modest operation and assumed she didn't understand the risks. "I understand your concerns," she replied calmly, "but sometimes unconventional approaches yield the most valuable data." Kellerman closed his briefing folder with finality. "The decision is made. All research flights are suspended until Diana weakens or moves beyond operational range. We'll continue monitoring from ground-based radar and satellite imagery." As the room emptied, Sarah remained seated, studying the latest satellite images on her tablet. Diana's structure was evolving rapidly, showing signs of the eye-wall replacement cycle she'd predicted. In 12 to 18 hours, the storm would either weaken significantly or undergo explosive intensification that would make it one of the most powerful hurricanes in recorded history. Elena Vasquez approached her table, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "You're going anyway, aren't you?" Sarah looked up, surprised by the young meteorologist's perceptiveness. "What makes you say that?" "Because I've read your research. Your data on rapid intensification patterns came from flights that nobody else was willing to make. You didn't discover those atmospheric processes by staying on the ground." Sarah studied Elena's face, seeing genuine scientific curiosity mixed with concern. "It's dangerous work. Important work," Elena corrected. "The kind of research that saves lives by improving our understanding of how these storms behave." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both studying the satellite imagery that showed Diana's majestic and terrifying spiral structure. Finally, Elena spoke again. "If you're planning to fly into that storm, I'd like to go with you." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Elena, this isn't a graduate research project. This is a hurricane that's killed people already. If something goes wrong out there, there won't be any rescue aircraft coming to help us." "I know the risks," Elena replied steadily. "But I also know that conventional approaches aren't going to solve the rapid intensification problem. Your methods are unconventional, but they work. I want to be part of advancing the science." Sarah considered the offer carefully. Elena was young but brilliant. Her dissertation research on tropical cyclone dynamics was groundbreaking, and her enthusiasm reminded Sarah of her own early career when the pursuit of knowledge seemed worth any risk. "It won't be comfortable," Sarah warned. "The King Air doesn't have the stability systems of the hurricane hunters. We'll be thrown around like a toy in a washing machine." "I have a strong stomach," Elena assured her. "And if we collect data that contradicts the official forecasts, there could be professional consequences. The meteorological community doesn't always welcome research that challenges established models." Elena's smile was determined. "Then we better make sure our data is absolutely bulletproof." 2 hours later, Sarah and Elena stood beside the King Air as Tom completed his final pre-flight inspection. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but the wind was already beginning to shift as Diana's outer bands approached the coast. Within hours, the entire region would be engulfed in the storm's fury. "I've loaded extra fuel," Tom reported. "You've got 6 hours of flight time, which should be more than enough for whatever crazy thing you're planning to do out there." Sarah smiled at his gruff affection. Tom had been with her through dozens of hurricane penetrations, never once suggesting that her research was too dangerous or her equipment inadequate. He understood that advancing scientific knowledge sometimes required taking calculated risks. "The aircraft is in perfect condition," he continued. Engines are running smooth, all systems are nominal, and I've triple-checked every piece of research equipment. Just promise me you'll be careful out there." "Always am," Sarah replied, though they both knew that flying into the heart of a Category 4 hurricane stretched the definition of careful. Lena climbed into the co-pilot's seat, her eyes wide with excitement and nervousness. She'd flown in research aircraft before, but never into conditions like this. The specialized data collection equipment filled the cabin, arrays of atmospheric sensors and computer systems that would record every detail of their encounter with Diana. Sarah settled into the pilot's seat and began her startup procedures. The King Air's engines came to life with their characteristic whine, the sound deepening as the turboprop spun up to operating speed. On the radio, air traffic control was coordinating the final evacuation flights, commercial aircraft hurrying to escape the storm's path. "Meridian Tower, King Air 847 Sierra Charlie, requesting clearance for departure," Sarah transmitted. There was a long pause before the controller responded. 847 Sierra Charlie, confirm your destination and intentions. "Meridian Tower, we're conducting atmospheric research in the Diana operational area. Flight plan is on file." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Another pause. Longer this time. Sarah could imagine the controller consulting with supervisors, wondering if they should allow a civilian aircraft to fly into a hurricane that had grounded military reconnaissance missions. 847 Sierra Charlie, be advised that all military research flights have been canceled due to extreme conditions. Recommend you delay departure until storm passes. Meridian Tower, we're aware of current conditions and are prepared for the mission. Requesting clearance for departure. The controller's voice carried obvious reluctance. 847 Sierra Charlie, cleared for departure. Good luck out there. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the King Air surge forward, its landing gear lifting off the runway as they climbed into the turbulent afternoon sky. Behind them, Meridian Airport was already battening down for the storm, ground crews securing aircraft and equipment before Diana's winds made outdoor work impossible. "So," Elena said, her voice tight with anticipation, "what exactly are we going to do that the hurricane hunters can't?" Sarah banked the aircraft toward the southwest, following a course that would intercept Diana's northern eye wall in approximately 90 minutes. "We're going to fly through the storm at altitudes and locations that larger aircraft can't handle. The King Air is small enough and tough enough to penetrate regions of the hurricane that would tear apart bigger planes. Such as the boundary layer where the eye wall meets the eye. There's a zone of extreme wind shear and turbulence that exists for only a few hundred feet of altitude. Most research aircraft fly either well above or well below that zone, but the most interesting atmospheric dynamics occur right in the middle of it." Elena studied the storm data on her laptop, comparing their flight path with Diana's predicted movement. "That sounds incredibly dangerous." "It is," Sarah admitted. "But it's also where we'll find the data that could revolutionize our understanding of rapid intensification. The interaction between the eye wall's updrafts and the eye's downdrafts creates atmospheric conditions that we've never been able to measure directly." The flight toward Diana took them over increasingly rough seas. The ocean's surface churned into whitecaps by the storm's outer bands. Sarah could feel the King Air beginning to respond to the hurricane's influence. Small bumps and vibrations that would intensify dramatically as they approached the eye wall. "There," Elena said, pointing ahead through the windscreen. "I can see it." Diana's eye wall rose before them like a mountain made of clouds, a towering circular wall of convection that stretched from the ocean's surface to nearly 50,000 feet above sea level. The storm's eye was clearly visible in the center, a column of relatively calm air surrounded by the most violent winds on Earth. Sarah keyed the radio, contacting the Hurricane Center's aircraft coordination frequency. "Hurricane Center, King Air 847 Sierra Charlie, beginning penetration of Diana's northern eye wall." Dr. Kellerman's voice crackled through the static. 847 Sierra Charlie. "We strongly advise against eye wall penetration. Current conditions exceed safe operating limits for your aircraft type. Hurricane Center, we're equipped for extreme weather operations and are beginning data collection now." Sarah could hear the frustration in Kellerman's response. "Dr. Chen, this is not the time for unsanctioned research. Return to base immediately." "Hurricane Center, We're conducting critical research that could improve future storm forecasting. We'll maintain contact throughout the mission." Before Kellerman could respond, Sarah switched to a different frequency, effectively ending the argument. Elena looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You just told the National Hurricane Center to mind their own business." "I told them we're doing our job," Sarah corrected. Sometimes advancing science requires making decisions that administrators don't understand. The King Air entered Diana's outer bands, and immediately the aircraft began to buck and roll as it encountered the storm's chaotic winds. Rain hammered against the windscreen with machine gun intensity, while lightning flickered through the clouds around them. Elena gripped her armrests as the aircraft lurched through a particularly violent downdraft. "This is just the beginning," Sarah warned, her hands steady on the controls despite the increasing turbulence. "The real excitement starts when we hit the eye wall." The data collection equipment was already working, sensors measuring wind speed, atmospheric pressure, temperature, and humidity at multiple altitudes. Elena monitored the displays, calling out readings as the numbers fluctuated wildly with each gust and downdraft. Wind speed varying from 60 to 120 knots, she reported. Pressure dropping rapidly. "We're definitely entering the more organized part of the storm." Sarah nodded. Her attention focused on flying the aircraft through conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. The King Air was built for this kind of work, but hurricanes were unpredictable, capable of generating forces that could overwhelm any aircraft. "There's the eye wall," she announced, pointing ahead to where the clouds seemed to form a nearly solid barrier. "Elena, make sure all the recording systems are active. We're about to collect data that nobody has ever gathered before." The impact was like flying into a concrete wall. One moment they were in rough but manageable conditions. The next they were inside a washing machine filled with wind, rain, and turbulence that defied description. The King Air was thrown upward, then slammed downward, then twisted sideways as competing wind flows battled for dominance. Elena's scream was lost in the roar of wind and rain battering the aircraft. The data displays flickered and jumped as sensors registered forces at the edge of their measurement capabilities. Wind speeds exceeded 180 miles per hour, gusting to over 200, while pressure readings fluctuated so rapidly they were nearly impossible to track. Sarah fought the controls, using every technique she'd learned in 15 years of hurricane flying to keep the aircraft intact and on course. The King Air groaned and shuddered, its airframe stressed to limits that no manufacturer had ever intended, but it held together through the worst of the eye wall's fury. "We're through!" Elena shouted as they suddenly emerged into the relative calm of Diana's eye. The contrast was startling, violent turbulence giving way to smooth air and clear skies. Below them, the ocean's surface was visible through the eye's opening, waves still mountainous but no longer hidden by driving rain and wind. "How are the data systems?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from the stress of the penetration. Elena checked her displays, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. "Everything recorded perfectly. We've got measurements from altitudes and locations that no one has ever sampled before." Sarah banked the King Air into a gentle orbit within Diana's eye, giving Elena time to analyze the preliminary data while she planned their next penetration. The eye wall surrounded them like the interior of a vast stadium, its walls rising to incredible heights and pulsing with internal lightning. "Sarah, look at these pressure readings," Elena said, her excitement overcoming her fear. The gradient across the eye wall interface is much steeper than any of the models predicted, and these wind shear measurements show patterns that could explain rapid intensification mechanisms. Sarah looked at the data, recognizing immediately that they'd captured something extraordinary. The atmospheric dynamics they'd measured were unlike anything in the existing literature, phenomena that could revolutionize understanding of how hurricanes intensified and evolved. "We need more data points," she decided. "Different altitudes, different aspects of the eye wall." Elena looked at her with wide eyes. "You want to go back through that? Multiple times. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study a storm of this intensity. We can't waste it." For the next 3 hours, Sarah and Elena conducted a systematic study of Hurricane Diana's internal structure, penetrating the eye wall repeatedly at different altitudes and headings. Each passage was terrifying, the King Air battered by winds and turbulence that would have destroyed less sturdy aircraft, but each passage also yielded invaluable data about the storm's behavior. They discovered that Diana's eye wall contained multiple embedded mesocyclones, rotating cells of intense convection that were driving the hurricane's continued intensification. The interaction between these cells and the storm's overall circulation created feedback loops that amplified the hurricane's power in ways that existing models couldn't predict. "This explains everything," Elena said during a brief respite in the eye. "The rapid intensification, the unusual satellite signatures, the pressure fluctuations. Diana isn't just a hurricane. She's a complex system of interacting storm cells that are feeding off each other." Sarah nodded, studying the data while planning their final penetration. "And if we're right, the models are underestimating her maximum potential intensity. Diana could become much stronger before landfall." Their final pass through the eye wall was the most violent yet, as Diana continued to intensify around them. Wind speeds now exceeded 190 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 220, making her one of the most powerful hurricanes ever recorded. The King Air was pushed to its absolute limits, but it emerged intact with data that would change hurricane science forever. As they flew back toward the coast, Sarah transmitted their preliminary findings to the Hurricane Center, knowing that the data would be met with skepticism and disbelief. The atmospheric processes they documented were so far outside the accepted understanding of hurricane behavior that many meteorologists would question their validity. Hurricane Center, King Air 847 Sierra Charlie, transmitting critical data on Diana's structure and intensification patterns. Dr. Kellerman's voice was tight with anger and concern. 847 Sierra Charlie, where have you been? We lost contact for over 3 hours. Hurricane Center, we've been conducting deep penetration research in Diana's eye wall. Transmitting data now that indicates the storm is continuing to intensify beyond current forecasts. There was a long pause before Kellerman responded. "Dr. Chen, your data is showing wind speeds and pressure readings that are physically impossible. We need you to return to base immediately for equipment calibration." Sarah exchanged glances with Elena, both women knowing that their findings would be dismissed as instrument error rather than genuine scientific discovery. It was a familiar pattern, one that Sarah had encountered throughout her career whenever her research challenged conventional wisdom. "Hurricane Center, our instruments are properly calibrated and our data is accurate. Diana is significantly stronger than current estimates, and her intensification rate suggests she could reach Category 5 status before landfall." "Negative, 847 Sierra Charlie. Our models show Diana maintaining current intensity. Return to base immediately." Sarah turned off the radio and looked at Elena, who was staring at the data displays with a mixture of excitement and frustration. They'd risked their lives to gather information that could save thousands of others, but the very people who needed that information most were refusing to listen. "What do we do now?" Elena asked. "We land, we process our data, and we prepare our findings for publication," Sarah replied. "The truth has a way of emerging, even when people don't want to hear it." But even as she spoke, Sarah could see Diana's outer bands approaching the Louisiana coast. Within hours, the storm would make landfall, and the accuracy of their data would be tested in the most dramatic way possible. If they were right about the hurricane's intensity, the destruction would be far worse than anyone expected. If they were wrong, Sarah's career and reputation would be destroyed, along with everything she'd worked to accomplish. As the King Air touched down at Meridian Airport, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their most important work was just beginning. The data they'd collected would either vindicate years of unconventional research or end her career in meteorology forever. But looking at Elena's excited face as she reviewed their unprecedented measurements of Diana's internal structure, Sarah knew they'd achieved something remarkable. They'd flown where no one else dared to go, measured what no one else could measure, and discovered atmospheric processes that could change hurricane science forever. Whether anyone would listen to them was another question entirely. The data processing room at Meridian Airport felt like a tomb at 3 a.m. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across banks of computer monitors displaying atmospheric measurements that defied conventional understanding. Sarah sat hunched over her workstation, cross-referencing wind speed data with pressure readings, while Elena worked at the adjacent terminal, her face illuminated by the glow of satellite imagery. They'd been analyzing their findings for 6 hours straight, subsisting on vending machine coffee and determination. Every calculation confirmed what they'd witnessed firsthand inside Diana's eye wall. The hurricane was far more powerful and complex than official forecasts indicated. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to a graph showing pressure fluctuations over time. "The deepening rate is unprecedented." Diana's central pressure dropped 18 millibars in the 4 hours we were studying her. That's almost twice the rate the Hurricane Center is reporting. Sarah leaned over to examine Elena's data, noting the consistent pattern of intensification that their instruments had captured. The wind speed measurements are even more dramatic. We recorded sustained winds of 195 miles per hour in the northeastern quadrant, with gusts exceeding 230. That would make Diana a Category 5 hurricane, Elena whispered, the implications sinking in. The evacuation zones are based on Category 4 projections. If we're right, the storm surge could be 20% higher than predicted. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes, knowing that thousands of lives hung in the balance of their calculations. The difference between a Category 4 and Category 5 hurricane wasn't academic. It meant the difference between manageable destruction and catastrophic devastation. We need to contact the Hurricane Center again, she decided. Even if they don't believe our data, they need to see it. Elena glanced at the clock on the wall. It's 3:15 in the morning. Diana makes landfall in less than 12 hours. Then we don't have time to waste. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the Hurricane Center's operations desk, knowing that someone would be monitoring Diana's approach around the clock. After several rings, a tired voice answered. National Hurricane Center. Operations. This is Dr. Sarah Chen. I need to speak with Dr. Kellerman immediately about updated Diana intensity data. There was a pause. Ma'am, Dr. Kellerman is in a meeting with FEMA coordinators. Can this wait until morning? No, it cannot wait. I have data showing that Diana has intensified beyond current forecasts. People's lives depend on this information reaching the right decision-makers. Another pause. Longer this time? Hold on, ma'am. I'll see if I can locate Dr. Kellerman. Sarah waited, listening to hold music while watching Elena organize their most compelling data points. The evidence was overwhelming. Diana was a monster storm that would devastate anything in her path with forces far exceeding official estimates. Chen? Kellerman's voice was sharp with fatigue and irritation. What's so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning? Dr. Kellerman, our data shows Diana has continued intensifying overnight. Central pressure has dropped to 901 millibars with maximum sustained winds of 195 miles per hour. She's now a Category 5 hurricane. The silence stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Kellerman spoke, his voice controlled but clearly skeptical. Dr. Chen, our latest reconnaissance flight shows Diana maintaining Category 4 intensity with central pressure around 920 millibars. Your readings are inconsistent with data from multiple reliable sources. Sir, we penetrated regions of the storm that reconnaissance aircraft don't typically sample. Our measurements were taken directly in the eye-wall interface zone, where the most intense dynamics occur. The zone that you entered without authorization, in an aircraft not certified for extreme weather operations, using equipment that hasn't been calibrated to National Weather Service standards. Sarah felt her frustration rising. Dr. Kellerman, the accuracy of our equipment isn't the issue here. The issue is that Diana is significantly stronger than your models indicate, and people are going to die if evacuation zones aren't expanded. Dr. Chen, I understand your concern, but we cannot base operational decisions on uncorroborated data from unauthorized flights. Our forecast remains unchanged. Diana will make landfall as a Category 4 hurricane with maximum sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. You're making a mistake, Sarah said quietly. A mistake that will cost lives. What I'm doing, Kellerman replied coldly, is following established protocols based on reliable data from certified sources. I suggest you do the same. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone for a moment, then set it down with deliberate care. Elena looked up from her computer with an expression of disbelief. They're not going to listen, are they? No, Sarah admitted. They're not. They returned to their data analysis, but now their work carried additional urgency. If the official forecasters wouldn't act on their findings, Sarah would have to find other ways to warn people about Diana's true strength. Over the next 2 hours, she sent detailed reports to every meteorologist, emergency manager, and media contact in her address book. Most didn't respond, but a few called back with questions about her methodology and findings. Dr. James Harrison from Louisiana State University was the first to take her seriously. "Sarah, I've been watching Diana's satellite presentation, and I think you might be onto something. The storm structure looks more organized than it should be for a Category 4 system. Jim, we measured atmospheric dynamics that I've never seen before in 15 years of hurricane research. Diana isn't just intensifying. She's developing internal structures that are amplifying her power exponentially. Can you send me your raw data? I want to run it through our mesoscale models and see what we get." Within an hour, Harrison called back with results that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "Sarah, your data is solid. When I input your measurements into our high-resolution models, Diana comes out as a Category 5 storm with the potential for historic storm surge heights. Will you contact the Hurricane Center? Maybe they'll listen to someone from LSU. I'm already drafting an urgent advisory, but Sarah, even if we convince them, it might be too late to expand evacuation zones. People are already hunkered down, and moving hundreds of thousands of residents in the next few hours would be logistically impossible." Sarah understood the implications. Even if they were eventually vindicated, the damage would already be done. Diana would make landfall with forces that coastal communities weren't prepared to handle. As dawn approached, Sarah and Elena continued processing data, documenting their findings with the methodical precision of scientists who knew their work would be scrutinized by skeptics. They created detailed reports, cross-referenced their measurements with historical storm data, and prepared visual presentations that clearly illustrated Diana's unprecedented intensity. "We should try to get some sleep," Elena suggested as the sun rose over the airport. "Diana won't make landfall for another 8 hours." But Sarah couldn't rest, not when she knew what was coming. She stood at the window, watching the hurricane's outer bands approach the coast. The wind was already picking up, bending palm trees and stirring up whitecaps on the nearby bayou. In a few hours, this relatively calm scene would be transformed into something from a nightmare. Her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. "Dr. Chen speaking." "Dr. Chen, this is Rebecca Martinez from Channel 8 News in New Orleans. I received your storm intensity report, and I'd like to interview you about your findings." Sarah hesitated. Going to the media was a risky move that could damage her professional reputation, but it might be the only way to warn people about Diana's true strength. "Ms. Martinez, what I have to say contradicts the official National Hurricane Center forecast. Are you prepared to broadcast information that challenges government weather predictions?" "Dr. Chen, if you have credible data suggesting that people are in greater danger than they realize, then yes, we're prepared to report that information. Can you be at our studio in an hour?" Sarah looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll be there." The drive to New Orleans took them through increasingly dramatic weather conditions. Diana's outer bands were making their presence felt, with gusting winds and intermittent downpours that made driving treacherous. They passed convoys of emergency vehicles heading inland, and long lines of cars carrying evacuees away from the coast. The television studio was a bustle of activity, reporters and technicians preparing for what would be one of the most important hurricane broadcasts in Louisiana history. Rebecca Martinez was a veteran meteorologist who'd covered dozens of storms, but even she seemed impressed by the severity of Sarah's data. "Dr. Chen, before we go on air, I need to understand exactly what you're claiming. Are you saying that Diana is stronger than the Hurricane Center is reporting?" "I'm saying that Diana has undergone rapid intensification that the standard monitoring systems haven't detected. Based on direct measurements taken inside the storm's eye wall, Diana has reached Category 5 intensity with winds exceeding 195 miles per hour. The storm surge could be 30% higher than current predictions." Martinez's eyes widened. 30% higher? That would put water levels at 25 feet or more in some areas. In some areas, yes. The communities that were told they'd see 15 feet of surge could experience 25. The difference could be catastrophic. They went live at 7:30, with Diana's landfall still 6 hours away. Martinez introduced Sarah as an independent hurricane researcher who'd flown directly into the storm, then let her present her findings to a television audience that included hundreds of thousands of people in Diana's path. "I want to be absolutely clear about what we observed," Sarah said, looking directly into the camera. Hurricane Diana is not the Category 4 storm described in official forecasts. Our direct measurements show sustained winds of 195 miles per hour, making this a Category 5 hurricane. The storm surge will be significantly higher than predicted, potentially reaching 25 to 30 feet in the most vulnerable areas. Martinez asked the obvious question. Dr. Chen, the National Hurricane Center hasn't issued any updates reflecting this intensity. Why do you believe your data is more accurate than official sources? Sarah had prepared for this question, knowing that her credibility depended on her answer. We flew into regions of the hurricane that standard reconnaissance aircraft don't typically penetrate. The eye-wall interface zone, where the most intense atmospheric dynamics occur, contains wind speeds and pressure gradients that aren't captured by conventional monitoring methods. You're saying that official forecasts are based on incomplete data? I'm saying that Diana is a complex storm system that exceeds the parameters of existing models. The rapid intensification we documented isn't reflected in current forecasts because the monitoring systems weren't designed to detect these specific atmospheric phenomena. The interview continued for 15 minutes, with Sarah explaining her research methods and displaying charts that showed Diana's unprecedented intensity. She could see the concern growing in Martinez's expression as the implications became clear. Dr. Chen, what should people do with this information? Many coastal residents have already decided to ride out the storm based on Category 4 projections. Sarah chose her words carefully, knowing that panic could be as dangerous as the storm itself. Anyone in areas predicted to experience storm surge should reconsider their evacuation plans. The difference between Category 4 and Category 5 isn't just academic. It's the difference between survivable and unsurvivable conditions. As they left the television studio, Elena looked shaken by the responsibility they'd just assumed. Sarah, what if we're wrong? What if our instruments malfunctioned or our calculations are off? Sarah understood Elena's concern. They'd just contradicted the nation's premier hurricane forecasting center on live television, basing their warnings on data that no one else could verify. If they were wrong, their careers would be destroyed, and public trust in weather forecasting would be damaged. Elena, I've been flying into hurricanes for 15 years. I've seen Category 1 storms and Category 5 monsters, and I know the difference. Diana is unlike anything I've ever encountered. Our data is accurate. They returned to the airport to monitor Diana's approach, watching satellite imagery that showed the hurricane bearing down on the Louisiana coast with terrifying majesty. The storm's eye was perfectly defined, surrounded by tightly wound spiral bands that stretched across hundreds of miles of Gulf waters. By noon, Diana's outer bands were battering the coast with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Storm surge was already beginning to inundate low-lying areas, pushing seawater miles inland through bayous and marshes. The first emergency calls were coming in from communities that had expected manageable flooding, but were instead experiencing catastrophic inundation. Sarah's phone began ringing constantly as reporters, meteorologists, and emergency officials sought updates on her storm intensity predictions. Each call brought reports that seemed to confirm her warnings. Storm surge heights exceeding predictions, wind damage more severe than expected, and emergency shelters being overwhelmed by evacuees who'd initially planned to weather the storm at home. Dr. Harrison called from LSU with updates from his research team. Sarah, we're getting reports from our coastal monitoring stations that confirm your predictions. Storm surge is running 20 to 25 feet in areas that were forecast for 15 feet maximum. How are the evacuation centers holding up? Overwhelmed. The increased evacuations triggered by your television interview may have saved thousands of lives. Emergency managers are calling it the most effective last-minute warning they've ever seen. By 2 o'clock, Diana's eye was clearly visible on radar, approaching the coast with winds that meteorological instruments were struggling to measure accurately. The Hurricane Center finally issued an updated advisory upgrading Diana to Category 5 status with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. Sarah felt no satisfaction in being proven right. The confirmation of Diana's intensity came too late to implement large-scale evacuations, but it did prompt emergency managers to open additional shelters and deploy more rescue resources to areas that were now expected to experience catastrophic damage. Elena monitored emergency radio frequencies, listening to reports from first responders who were documenting Diana's impact in real time. "Sarah, listen to this. A Coast Guard helicopter just reported that the storm surge in Plaquemines Parish has reached 28 feet. That's 13 feet higher than the original prediction." Sarah nodded grimly. Their data had been accurate, but the validation came at a terrible cost. Communities that had prepared for a manageable disaster were instead facing devastation that would reshape the landscape permanently. As Diana's eye wall approached the coast, Sarah and Elena drove to a sheltered observation point where they could witness the hurricane's landfall safely. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a wall of clouds stretching from the ocean's surface to the stratosphere, rotating with mechanical precision while generating winds that could level entire neighborhoods. The eye wall made contact with the Louisiana coast at 3:15 in the afternoon, bringing with it winds that shredded buildings, uprooted century-old trees, and pushed massive walls of water miles inland. The sound was indescribable, a combination of freight train and jet engine that could be felt as much as heard. For 6 hours, Diana unleashed her fury on the Gulf Coast, carving a path of destruction that extended from the immediate shoreline to areas 50 miles inland. Storm surge reached heights that exceeded even Sarah's most dire predictions, inundating communities that had never experienced flooding in recorded history. But as reports began filtering in from emergency responders, a pattern emerged that validated Sarah's warnings. While the destruction was unprecedented, the death toll was significantly lower than expected for a storm of Diana's magnitude. The last-minute evacuations prompted by Sarah's television interview had moved thousands of people from areas that were ultimately devastated beyond recognition. "Dr. Chen?" The voice on her phone belonged to Rebecca Martinez. "I wanted to give you an update from our emergency management contacts. They're estimating that your warning may have saved between 3,000 and 5,000 lives." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "What about the Hurricane Center? Any word on their response to the intensity updates?" "Off the record? They're conducting a comprehensive review of their forecasting procedures. Your data is being analyzed by teams from multiple agencies. There's talk of incorporating your research methods into operational hurricane monitoring." As night fell and Diana moved inland, weakening as she lost contact with the warm Gulf waters that had fueled her intensity, Sarah and Elena returned to their makeshift laboratory at the airport. Their data processing equipment had recorded every detail of the hurricane's passage, creating a comprehensive archive of atmospheric measurements that would influence hurricane science for decades. "What happens now?" Elena asked as they began preliminary analysis of their landfall data. "Now we write papers, present findings, and hope that the meteorological community learns from what we discovered," Sarah replied. "But more importantly, we start developing new monitoring techniques that can detect rapid intensification events before they become catastrophic." Over the following days, as the full scope of Diana's destruction became apparent, Sarah found herself at the center of a scientific revolution. Her unconventional research methods had not only predicted the storm's true intensity, but had also revealed atmospheric processes that challenged fundamental assumptions about hurricane behavior. The Hurricane Center quietly invited her to participate in their post-storm analysis, acknowledging that her data had filled critical gaps in their understanding of Diana's evolution. Dr. Kellerman, the same man who had dismissed her warnings 12 hours before landfall, now spoke respectfully about her contributions to hurricane science. "Dr. Chen," he said during a conference call with meteorologists from across the country, "your research has identified monitoring techniques that we need to incorporate into operational forecasting. Would you be willing to work with us on developing new protocols?" Sarah exchanged glances with Elena, both women understanding that this was the validation they'd sought throughout their careers. The old King Air that everyone had dismissed as junk had proven capable of collecting data that the most sophisticated aircraft couldn't gather. "Dr. Kellerman, I'd be honored to collaborate with the Hurricane Center. But I want to be clear about something. Unconventional approaches aren't necessarily inferior approaches. Sometimes the best way to understand nature is to meet it on its own terms." "Understood. And Dr. Chen, thank you for what you did. Your warning saved lives." Elena smiled as Sarah ended the call. "So what's next for the junk airplane and its crazy pilot?" Sarah looked out the window at her King Air, battered but intact, after its encounter with one of the most powerful hurricanes in recorded history. The aircraft that had been dismissed as obsolete had just revolutionized hurricane research and proven that sometimes the oldest tools were the most effective ones. Next, we modify the aircraft for even more extreme conditions. If we're going to be flying into Category 5 hurricanes as part of official research operations, we need equipment that can handle anything nature throws at us. But even as she spoke about future research, Sarah knew that their most important work was already complete. They demonstrated that unconventional thinking and determination could overcome institutional skepticism and save thousands of lives. The phone calls began arriving within hours of Diana's passage. Meteorologists and atmospheric scientists from around the world seeking details about Sarah's research methods and findings. Her techniques for measuring eye wall dynamics were being hailed as revolutionary, opening new possibilities for understanding and predicting hurricane behavior. Dr. Maria Santos from the University of Miami called with an offer that surprised Sarah. Dr. Chen, we'd like to offer you a full professorship in our meteorology department, with funding for a dedicated hurricane research program. Your work on rapid intensification has implications that extend far beyond operational forecasting. Similar offers came from institutions across the country, each recognizing that Sarah's unconventional approach had yielded insights that traditional methods had missed. The pilot who'd been dismissed as a reckless amateur was suddenly being courted by the most prestigious meteorology programs in the world. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Captain Mike Stevens, the Hurricane Hunter pilot who'd questioned Sarah's qualifications before Diana's landfall, called to offer an apology and a proposal. Dr. Chen, I owe you an apology. I judged your methods based on appearances rather than results, and I was wrong. Your research probably saved more lives than any single flight mission I've ever flown. Captain Stevens, we all have our roles in hurricane research. The important thing is that we learn from each storm and improve our understanding. That's actually why I'm calling. The Air Force is interested in incorporating some of your techniques into our operations. Would you be willing to train some of our crews in extreme weather penetration procedures? Sarah considered the offer, understanding that it represented complete acceptance of her methods by the military aviation community. I'd be honored to work with your crews, Captain. But I have one condition. We use my aircraft and my techniques. No compromises based on conventional wisdom. Stevens laughed. Ma'am, after what you accomplished with Diana, I wouldn't dream of questioning your methods. When can we start? Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself overwhelmed with opportunities and requests. Research institutions wanted to fund her work. Government agencies sought her consultation, and aircraft manufacturers asked for input on designing new hurricane research platforms. Elena was offered positions at several major universities, her contributions to Sarah's research having established her as a rising star in atmospheric sciences. But she chose to remain with Sarah's independent operation, helping to expand their research capabilities and train new researchers in their unconventional methods. Why turn down all those prestigious offers? Sarah asked as they worked on modifications to the King Air's data collection systems. Because what we're doing here is more important than prestige, Elena replied. We're proving that independent research can contribute just as much to scientific understanding as institutional programs. Maybe more, because we're not constrained by conventional thinking. The validation of Sarah's work had implications that extended far beyond her personal vindication. Hurricane research programs across the country began re-evaluating their methodologies, incorporating elements of her approach into their own operations. The assumption that bigger, more expensive equipment always produced better results was being challenged by evidence that smaller, more flexible platforms could access atmospheric conditions that larger aircraft couldn't handle. Dr. Harrison at LSU established a collaboration with Sarah's operation, providing university resources while allowing her to maintain her independence. Sarah, what you've accomplished changes everything we thought we knew about hurricane monitoring. The atmospheric dynamics you discovered in Diana's eye wall are being studied by researchers around the world. Jim, the important thing is that we're advancing the science. Individual recognition is secondary to improving our ability to protect people from these storms. But recognition was coming whether Sarah sought it or not. The American Meteorological Society announced that she would receive their highest honor for contributions to atmospheric science, while the National Academy of Sciences invited her to present her findings at their annual meeting. Media attention intensified as well, with major news outlets running features on the independent researcher whose determination had revolutionized hurricane science. Sarah found herself profiled in magazines and newspapers, described as a maverick scientist who'd proven that unconventional approaches could yield extraordinary results. The most satisfying recognition, however, came from the communities that had been affected by Diana. Letters and emails arrived daily from people whose lives had been saved by Sarah's last-minute warning, families who'd evacuated because of her television interview and survived while their homes were destroyed. One letter particularly moved Sarah. It came from a family in Plaquemines Parish who'd initially planned to ride out the storm but changed their minds after seeing her interview. Dr. Jen, we wanted to thank you for having the courage to speak out when the official forecasters were telling us something different. We evacuated at the last minute because of your warning, and our house was completely destroyed by the storm surge. If we'd stayed, we would have died. Our children are alive today because you were willing to challenge the experts and tell us the truth. Elena read the letter over Sarah's shoulder, tears forming in her eyes. Sarah, this is why we do what we do. All the professional recognition in the world doesn't compare to knowing that we saved lives. Sarah nodded, understanding that their work had achieved something more important than scientific advancement. They demonstrated that individual determination and unconventional thinking could make a difference when lives were at stake. The transformation in how others perceived Sarah's work was dramatic. The same aviation community that had dismissed her aircraft as junk now sought her expertise in designing new research platforms. The meteorological establishment that had ignored her warnings now invited her to lead major research initiatives. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The pilot who'd been invisible at the back of briefing rooms was now confident in her expertise and unafraid to challenge conventional wisdom when scientific evidence supported her conclusions. Tom Morrison, her longtime crew chief, noticed the difference as they prepared for another research flight. Doc, you carry yourself differently now, like you know your place is at the front of the room, not hiding in the back. Sarah smiled as she conducted her pre-flight inspection, running her hands over the King Air's battle-scarred fuselage. Tom, I finally understand that being right matters more than being popular. If you have good data and sound methodology, you don't need anyone's permission to contribute to science. The King Air had undergone extensive modifications based on lessons learned during the Diana mission. New sensors could measure atmospheric phenomena that had never been recorded directly, while reinforced structures allowed the aircraft to penetrate even more extreme conditions safely. She looks like the same old airplane, Tom observed, but she's got capabilities that would make the hurricane hunters jealous. Sarah laughed, understanding that her aircraft had become something unique in the world of atmospheric research. A platform that combined proven reliability with cutting-edge measurement capabilities, operated by researchers who weren't constrained by institutional limitations. As they prepared for their next hurricane season, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from obscurity to recognition. The path hadn't been easy, requiring years of independent research, professional risk-taking, and the courage to challenge established authorities when evidence demanded it. But the result had been worth every difficulty. Hurricane forecasting was being revolutionized by techniques that Sarah had developed in her modest hangar, using an aircraft that others had dismissed as obsolete. The knowledge gained from their Diana mission was already being incorporated into operational procedures that would improve storm predictions for decades to come. Elena joined her beside the King Air, both women looking up at the aircraft that had carried them into the heart of one of the most powerful storms in recorded history. Ready for the next adventure? Sarah nodded, knowing that their work was just beginning. Each hurricane season would bring new opportunities to expand scientific understanding, refine measurement techniques, and potentially save lives through improved forecasting. Always ready, she replied. That's what this old bird was built for. As they climbed into the cockpit for another research flight, Sarah felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that came with pushing boundaries and exploring atmospheric phenomena that few humans had ever witnessed directly. The pilot who'd once been invisible was now leading a revolution in hurricane science, proving that determination and unconventional thinking could overcome any obstacle. The King Air's engines spun up with their characteristic whine, and Sarah advanced the throttles for takeoff. Ahead lay another storm, another opportunity to gather data that might save lives and advance human understanding of nature's most powerful forces. Behind them lay the proof that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from the most expensive equipment or prestigious institutions, but from individuals who refused to accept limitations and were willing to fly where others wouldn't dare to go. The junk airplane and its determined pilot had become legends in the world of hurricane research, their story inspiring a new generation of atmospheric scientists to think beyond conventional boundaries and pursue knowledge wherever it led, regardless of what others might think about their methods or equipment. As they climbed into the storm-pregnant sky, Sarah smiled at the irony. The aircraft that everyone had called junk had just changed the world of meteorology forever. Sometimes the most powerful tool was the one that others underestimated, operated by someone who refused to be underestimated themselves. Diana had been Sarah's vindication, but more importantly, she'd been proof that scientific truth didn't depend on institutional approval or expensive equipment. It depended on courage, determination, and the willingness to fly into the unknown in search of knowledge that could benefit all humanity. The King Air banked toward the developing storm system, ready for whatever nature had in store. Sarah Chen was no longer the invisible pilot in the back of the briefing room. She was the researcher who'd revolutionized hurricane science by refusing to accept that her old airplane wasn't good enough to compete with the most sophisticated aircraft in the world. She'd proven that sometimes the most powerful force in scientific discovery wasn't advanced technology or institutional backing, but simply the courage to be right when everyone else was wrong. 5 years after Hurricane Diana changed everything, Sarah Chen stood before an auditorium filled with the world's leading atmospheric scientists at the International Hurricane Research Symposium in Miami. The venue was packed beyond capacity, with researchers from 37 countries gathered to hear about the latest developments in extreme weather forecasting. Sarah's presentation was the keynote address, a recognition that would have seemed impossible during her days as an invisible contractor flying a forgotten aircraft. The title slide behind her read, Revolutionary Atmospheric Monitoring, Lessons from 5 Years of Extreme Weather Penetration Research. Below it was a photograph of her modified King Air, now designated as Research Platform Alpha 1, surrounded by a fleet of similar aircraft that comprised the world's most advanced independent hurricane research operation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had earned her place through extraordinary achievements. "When I first flew into Diana's eye wall 5 years ago, I was using techniques that many considered obsolete and equipment that others dismissed as inadequate. Today, those same techniques form the foundation of operational hurricane monitoring programs in 14 countries." The audience listened with rapt attention as Sarah described the evolution of hurricane research that had followed her groundbreaking work. The atmospheric dynamics she'd discovered in Diana's eye wall had been confirmed in dozens of subsequent storms, leading to fundamental revisions in how meteorologists understood rapid intensification processes. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now Director of Atmospheric Research for the Chen Hurricane Research Institute, controlled the presentation slides from her position in the front row. The partnership that had begun with Elena's courageous decision to fly into Diana had evolved into one of the most productive collaborations in modern meteorological science. "The key insight," Sarah continued, "was recognizing that hurricanes are not simple rotating systems, but complex networks of interacting atmospheric processes that operate on multiple scales simultaneously. To understand these processes, we needed measurement techniques that could capture phenomena occurring in specific regions of the storm that conventional monitoring systems couldn't access." She clicked to the next slide, showing a cutaway diagram of a hurricane's internal structure with detailed annotations marking the locations where their specialized equipment collected data. "The eye wall interface zone, where we conducted our most critical measurements, exists in a layer only a few hundred feet thick. This zone contains wind shear patterns and pressure gradients that drive rapid intensification, but it's too turbulent for large aircraft and too localized for satellite detection." A hand rose in the audience. Dr. James Kellerman, the former Hurricane Center deputy director who had once dismissed Sarah's warnings, now served as an advisor to her research institute. The transformation in their relationship reflected the broader changes that had occurred in the hurricane research community. "Dr. Chen," Kellerman said, "can you elaborate on how your findings have influenced operational forecasting accuracy? The improvement in landfall predictions over the past 5 years has been remarkable." Sarah smiled, remembering their contentious conversations during Diana's approach. "Dr. Kellerman, The accuracy improvements stem from understanding that rapid intensification isn't a random process but a predictable response to specific atmospheric conditions. When we can identify those conditions early enough, we can forecast intensity changes that previous models missed entirely. She advanced to a slide showing forecast accuracy statistics that told a compelling story. Hurricane landfall predictions were now accurate to within 50 miles at 48 hours before impact, compared to the 100-mile accuracy that had been standard before Diana. More importantly, intensity forecasts had improved by 30%, giving coastal communities crucial additional time to prepare for extreme storms. The real breakthrough, Sarah explained, came from recognizing that small aircraft operated by experienced crews could collect data that large, heavily instrumented planes couldn't gather. It wasn't about having the most expensive equipment. It was about being able to position that equipment in the right place at the right time. Following her presentation, Sarah was surrounded by researchers eager to discuss her findings and methodologies. The contrast with her early career was striking. Instead of being ignored or dismissed, she was now sought out by scientists who recognized her expertise and valued her unconventional approach. Dr. Maria Santos from the University of Miami, who had offered Sarah a professorship 5 years earlier, approached with a proposal that reflected how dramatically the field had evolved. Sarah, we're establishing a new graduate program in extreme weather research, based primarily on the techniques you've developed. Would you consider serving as the program director? Maria, I appreciate the offer, but Elena and I have something even more ambitious in mind. We're planning to establish an international training center where researchers from around the world can learn these techniques. We want to democratize extreme weather research, make it accessible to scientists who don't have access to million-dollar aircraft and government funding. The conversation was interrupted by Tom Morrison, now Sarah's operations director, who approached with news that would test everything they'd learned over the past 5 years. Doc, we've got a situation developing in the Caribbean. The Hurricane Center is asking for our immediate assistance. Sarah excused herself from the academic discussions and followed Tom to a quiet corner where he could brief her privately. What kind of situation? Hurricane Eduardo is behaving unlike anything they've seen before. It's a Category 5 storm that should be weakening as it approaches cooler water, but instead it's maintaining intensity and showing signs of further strengthening. The Hurricane Center has lost 2 reconnaissance aircraft, not crashed, but their instruments failed completely when they tried to penetrate the eye wall. Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with apprehension. Eduardo sounded like Diana's more dangerous cousin, a storm that might be pushing the boundaries of what was considered meteorologically possible. Where is it headed? Current track has it making landfall in South Carolina in 36 hours. But here's the strange part. Eduardo's structure is unlike anything in the historical record. The eye wall appears to be generating its own weather systems, with embedded tornadoes and wind speeds that are off the scale. Sarah looked across the auditorium at Elena, who was engaged in animated discussion with a group of European researchers. Their next mission would interrupt the symposium, but it might also provide an opportunity to demonstrate their techniques to the international scientific community. Tom, prep Research Platform Alpha-1 for immediate departure. Full extreme weather configuration, and make sure all the data recording systems are operational. If Eduardo is as unusual as you're describing, we need to document everything. Within 2 hours, Sarah and Elena were airborne, leading a 3-aircraft formation toward the Caribbean. The other 2 planes carried researchers from 6 different countries, all eager to witness the advanced techniques that had revolutionized hurricane science. What had started as an emergency response was becoming an international research mission. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the Japan Meteorological Agency flew an Alpha 2, the second King Air in Sarah's fleet. Dr. Chen, our satellite data shows Eduardo exhibiting characteristics we've never observed before. The storm appears to be generating its own microclimate systems within the eye wall. Dr. Hans Müller from the German Weather Service, flying an ALPHA-3, added his observations. The electromagnetic signatures are extraordinary. Eduardo is producing lightning patterns that don't match any known atmospheric models. It's as if the storm has developed its own electromagnetic field. As they approached Eduardo's location, Sarah could see why the conventional aircraft had experienced problems. The hurricane's appearance was unlike anything she'd encountered in 20 years of storm research. Instead of the typical symmetric spiral structure, Eduardo displayed multiple rotating cells embedded within the main circulation. each generating its own weather patterns. "Elena, are you seeing this?" Sarah asked as they studied the storm through their reinforced cockpit windows. "It's like looking at a hurricane inside a hurricane, inside a hurricane." Elena replied, her voice filled with scientific excitement, mixed with healthy respect for the forces they were approaching. "The nested circulation patterns are creating wind shear effects that our models never predicted." Sarah began her standard pre-penetration checklist, but she knew that Eduardo would require modifications to their usual procedures. The storm's complex structure meant that safe penetration routes might not exist, and their equipment would be tested beyond its design limitations. "All aircraft, this is Alpha 1, she transmitted. "Eduardo is exhibiting characteristics that exceed our previous experience. We'll conduct the initial penetration solo, then determine if conditions allow for the other aircraft to follow." Dr. Tanaka's voice crackled through the radio. "ALPHA-1, recommend we maintain formation integrity. If Eduardo is as dangerous as it appears, you shouldn't penetrate alone." Sarah appreciated the concern, but she knew that her responsibility as mission leader meant accepting the greatest risks personally. "Negative, ALPHA-2. We have the most experience with extreme conditions, and this aircraft has the most advanced protection systems. We'll assess the situation first." The entry into Eduardo's outer bands was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Instead of the gradual increase in turbulence that characterized normal hurricanes, Eduardo's periphery contained distinct cells of extreme weather that appeared and disappeared with no apparent pattern. Wind speeds varied from calm to over 150 miles per hour within distances of just a few hundred yards. "Sarah, these readings can't be correct," Elena said, monitoring their instruments as they penetrated deeper into the storm. "I'm showing pressure fluctuations of 30 millibars per minute. That's physically impossible." "Unless Eduardo is operating under different physical laws," Sarah replied, fighting to maintain control as the King Air was battered by forces that defied conventional understanding. "This storm may be showing us atmospheric processes that we've never encountered before." As they approached the eye wall, Sarah realized that Eduardo represented a new category of hurricane entirely. The conventional classification system, which topped out at Category 5, was inadequate to describe a storm that seemed to generate its own physics. The eye wall appeared to extend from the ocean surface to the top of the troposphere, a column of rotating air nearly 10 miles high. "Elena, I need you to start recording everything. Every instrument reading, every visual observation, every detail about how the aircraft responds. If we survive this penetration, the data could rewrite atmospheric science textbooks." The impact with Eduardo's eye wall was like colliding with a solid wall of violence. The King Air was immediately thrown into a tumbling spiral that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. Sarah fought the controls with every technique she'd learned over 2 decades, while Elena operated the recording equipment despite being thrown against her restraints with crushing force. Inside the eye wall, they discovered atmospheric conditions that challenged fundamental understanding of how hurricanes operated. Instead of a single circulation pattern, Eduardo contained multiple rotating systems operating at different altitudes and speeds. The interaction between these systems created wind shear effects that generated their own weather patterns, including tornadoes that formed spontaneously and dissipated within minutes. "Sarah, look at the pressure readings," Elena shouted over the roar of wind and rain battering their aircraft. "Eduardo's central pressure is 872 millibars. That's lower than any hurricane in recorded history." Sarah glanced at the instruments, seeing numbers that represented forces beyond anything she'd previously encountered. Eduardo wasn't just a powerful hurricane. He was an atmospheric phenomenon that existed at the extreme edge of what was meteorologically possible. They spent 45 minutes inside Eduardo's chaotic structure, collecting data that would take months to analyze fully. When they finally emerged into the relative calm of the eye, both women were exhausted from the physical and mental stress of surviving conditions that had destroyed the instruments of conventional aircraft. "Alpha 2 and ALPHA-3, this is Alpha 1, Sarah transmitted to the other aircraft. "Eduardo's internal structure exceeds safe operational limits for research aircraft. We recommend maintaining position outside the storm while we process initial data." Dr. Tanaka's response reflected the concern of the international researchers. "ALPHA-1. What did you find in there? Your aircraft disappeared from our tracking systems for nearly an hour." We found atmospheric processes that may require us to revise our understanding of hurricane physics, Sarah replied. Eduardo isn't just an extreme hurricane. He's a new type of storm system entirely. Over the following hours, as they processed their measurements and compared them with data from Eduardo's continued intensification, the magnitude of their discovery became apparent. The storm represented a quantum leap in hurricane evolution, possibly driven by climate change effects that were creating atmospheric conditions unlike anything in the historical record. Elena's analysis revealed that Eduardo was operating as a self-sustaining atmospheric engine, drawing energy not just from warm ocean water, but also from electromagnetic processes that generated additional heat within the storm's core. The discovery had implications that extended far beyond meteorology, suggesting that extreme weather systems might be evolving faster than scientists could study them. Sarah, if Eduardo maintains this intensity and makes landfall in South Carolina, the destruction will be beyond anything in recorded history, Elena said as she completed her preliminary calculations. We're looking at storm surge heights of 40 feet or more, with winds that could level entire cities. Sarah understood that they faced the same dilemma that had confronted them during Hurricane Diana. They possessed critical information that contradicted official forecasts, but the implications were so extreme that many people would dismiss their findings as impossible. The Hurricane Center's latest advisory described Eduardo as a Category 5 storm with maximum winds of 185 miles per hour, dangerous but within the range of previous experience. Sarah's data showed sustained winds of 220 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 280, numbers that placed Eduardo in a category that didn't exist in current classification systems. Elena, we need to contact the Hurricane Center immediately. If Eduardo makes landfall with the intensity we measured, the evacuation zones are completely inadequate. Dr. Kellerman answered Sarah's call personally, his tone reflecting both respect for her expertise and concern about the implications of her findings. Sarah, our models show Eduardo maintaining Category 5 intensity through landfall. Are you suggesting that our projections are underestimating the storm's power? Jim, Eduardo isn't a Category 5 hurricane by any conventional definition. The atmospheric processes we documented represent a new type of storm system with destructive potential that exceeds our current classification scheme. I'm transmitting our data now, but the bottom line is that coastal communities aren't prepared for what's coming. The silence that followed Sarah's transmission lasted nearly a minute. When Kellerman finally responded, his voice carried the weight of someone grappling with information that challenged everything he thought he knew about hurricanes. Sarah, your data shows wind speeds and pressure readings that our meteorologists are calling physically impossible. We need time to verify these measurements before we can consider revising our forecasts. Jim, we don't have time for extended verification. Eduardo makes landfall in 28 hours. If I'm right about his intensity, the difference between our forecasts could mean the difference between thousands of deaths and tens of thousands. Kellerman's response revealed the institutional constraints that still hampered rapid response to extreme weather threats. Sarah, I understand your concern, but we cannot issue forecasts based on data that hasn't been independently verified. The economic and social costs of unnecessary evacuations are enormous. Sarah ended the call feeling the familiar frustration of bureaucratic inertia confronting scientific evidence. But this time she had resources and credibility that she'd lacked during the Diana crisis. The international researchers who'd witnessed Eduardo's unprecedented structure would provide independent verification of her findings. Dr. Tanaka called within an hour, his voice reflecting excitement and concern in equal measure. Sarah, our analysis of Eduardo's electromagnetic signatures confirms your intensity measurements. This storm is generating atmospheric processes that we've never observed before. Dr. Muller's assessment was equally supportive. Sarah, the German Weather Service is prepared to issue advisories based on your data. Eduardo represents a threat that exceeds conventional hurricane categories. Over the following hours, a coalition of international weather services began issuing warnings that described Eduardo as an unprecedented atmospheric phenomenon requiring extreme protective measures. While the U.S. Hurricane Center maintained their Category 5 forecast, meteorologists from Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada warned that Eduardo's true intensity might be significantly higher. The conflicting forecasts created confusion among coastal residents, but they also prompted additional evacuations by people who chose to err on the side of caution. Sarah's reputation as the researcher who'd accurately predicted Diana's intensity gave weight to the international warnings, encouraging thousands of people to leave areas that might be devastated by Eduardo's unprecedented power. As Eduardo approached the South Carolina coast, Sarah and her team maintained continuous monitoring from aircraft positioned safely outside the storm's destructive range. Their real-time measurements confirmed that the hurricane was maintaining its extraordinary intensity despite encountering conditions that should have caused weakening. Elena, Eduardo's eye wall structure is actually becoming more organized as he approaches land, Sarah observed as they analyzed the latest data. Most hurricanes weaken when they encounter land interaction, but Eduardo seems to be drawing energy from the temperature differential between ocean and land surfaces. Elena's calculations supported Sarah's observations. He's behaving like a massive heat engine, converting temperature differences into kinetic energy with efficiency that exceeds anything in our atmospheric models. If this represents a new type of hurricane behavior, we may need to fundamentally revise our understanding of how these systems operate. Eduardo made landfall at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time, bringing with him forces that redefine the concept of extreme weather. The initial reports from emergency responders confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Storm surge heights exceeded 40 feet in some areas, while sustained winds stripped the landscape bare for miles inland. But the additional evacuations prompted by international warnings had moved nearly 200,000 additional people from areas that were ultimately devastated beyond recognition. While the destruction was catastrophic, the death toll was significantly lower than it would have been if residents had relied solely on official U.S. forecasts. The validation of Sarah's Eduardo predictions established her as the world's foremost authority on extreme hurricane research. The atmospheric processes she documented were confirmed by multiple independent sources, leading to the recognition that climate change was creating storm systems that exceeded the parameters of existing meteorological models. Dr. Santos from the University of Miami called with an updated offer that reflected Sarah's elevated status in the scientific community. Sarah, instead of joining our faculty, we'd like to partner with your institute to establish a new international center for extreme weather research. You would direct the program with complete autonomy and unlimited research funding. Similar offers arrived from institutions around the world, each recognizing that Sarah's unconventional methods had produced insights that traditional approaches had missed. The pilot who'd once been dismissed as a reckless amateur was now being courted by the most prestigious research organizations on the planet. But Sarah's response reflected the independence that had always driven her work. Maria, Elena, and I appreciate these offers, but we've decided to remain independent. Our most important discoveries have come from being able to pursue research without institutional constraints. We want to continue operating that way. The decision to maintain independence allowed Sarah and Elena to establish the Global Extreme Weather Research Network, an international collaboration that connected researchers from dozens of countries while maintaining the flexibility to pursue unconventional approaches. Their King Air fleet grew to include 12 aircraft, each equipped with specialized sensors and operated by crews trained in Sarah's techniques. Tom Morrison, now managing a staff of 40 technicians and pilots, oversaw the maintenance and operation of what had become the world's most advanced independent atmospheric research operation. Doc, remember when people used to call your King Air junk? Now we've got scientists from every major university in the world begging to fly on these planes. Sarah laughed as she watched her original aircraft undergo modifications that would allow it to penetrate even more extreme conditions. The plane that had once been dismissed as obsolete now incorporated technology that made it more capable than aircraft costing 10 times as much. Tom, I've learned that the value of a tool isn't determined by its age or cost, but by the skill and determination of the person using it. That old King Air proved that persistence and unconventional thinking can accomplish things that all the expensive equipment in the world can't match. 5 years after Eduardo, Sarah received recognition that represented the ultimate validation of her career. The Nobel Committee announced that she would receive the Nobel Prize in Physics for her discoveries in atmospheric dynamics and their applications to extreme weather prediction. The announcement described her work as fundamental contributions to understanding atmospheric processes that have revolutionized meteorological science and saved countless lives through improved hurricane forecasting. It was the first time the Physics Prize had been awarded for meteorological research, reflecting the committee's recognition that Sarah's discoveries had implications extending far beyond weather prediction. Elena, now a Nobel laureate herself for her contributions to atmospheric physics, joined Sarah at the awards ceremony in Stockholm. The two women who had risked their lives flying into Hurricane Diana were now recognized as the leading authorities on extreme weather research, their unconventional methods having produced insights that changed scientific understanding of atmospheric processes. During her Nobel acceptance speech, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from obscurity to international recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, the discoveries that led to this honor began with a simple belief that understanding nature requires the courage to engage with it directly, even when that means using methods that others consider unconventional or equipment that others dismiss as inadequate. She paused, looking out at an audience that included many of the scientists who had once questioned her approaches. The atmosphere doesn't care about institutional prestige or equipment costs. It responds to careful observation, rigorous analysis, and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when evidence demands it. The speech concluded with a message that captured the essence of Sarah's career. Science advances not through expensive equipment or prestigious institutions, but through the determination of individuals who refuse to accept limitations and are willing to pursue knowledge wherever it leads, regardless of what others might think about their methods. As Sarah and Elena returned to their research institute following the Nobel ceremony, they found their hangar filled with young scientists from around the world, all eager to learn the techniques that had revolutionized extreme weather research. The next generation of atmospheric researchers would carry forward the lessons learned from flying into the hearts of the most powerful storms on Earth. Tom Morrison greeted them with characteristic humor. "Doc, your Nobel Prize looks nice, but it's not going to help you fly through the next Category 6 hurricane." Sarah smiled, understanding that Tom's comment captured an important truth. Recognition and awards were gratifying, but the real measure of their success would be their ability to continue advancing scientific understanding and protecting people from nature's most extreme forces. "Tom, get Alpha 1 ready for another mission. There's a storm developing in the Pacific that's showing some interesting characteristics. Elena and I want to investigate." As they prepared for their next research flight, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since the day she'd first flown into Hurricane Diana, with nothing but an old King Air and a determination to understand atmospheric processes that others had dismissed as unknowable. The invisible pilot who'd once sat in the back of briefing rooms had become the most recognized atmospheric researcher in the world, her techniques taught at universities across the globe, and her insights incorporated into operational weather forecasting systems that protected millions of people. But perhaps most importantly, she'd proven that scientific discovery didn't require institutional backing or expensive equipment. It required curiosity, courage, and the willingness to pursue knowledge, even when that pursuit led into the heart of nature's most powerful and dangerous phenomena. As the King Air lifted off for another research mission, Sarah knew that their work would continue as long as extreme weather threatened human lives and scientific questions remained unanswered. The aircraft that everyone had called junk had become the foundation of a research program that spanned the globe, operated by scientists who shared Sarah's belief that understanding nature required the courage to meet it on its own terms. The story that had begun with a dismissed pilot and an obsolete airplane had evolved into a global movement that was advancing human understanding of atmospheric processes while saving lives through improved weather prediction. It was proof that the most important scientific discoveries often came not from the most expensive laboratories or prestigious institutions, but from individuals who refused to be limited by conventional thinking and were willing to fly where others feared to go. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.